Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through my first impressions for Cowboy Bebop. Just to be clear, in no way is this going to be a formal review, rather it's just truly going to be a casual chat through of my first impressions based off of specifically the first 3 episodes. And if you need a refresher, those first 3 episodes are made up of Asteroid, Blues, Stray Dog, Strut, and Honky Tonk Women. When I went into this, I, of course, as always, try to avoid as much as possible hearing anything about the stories that I plan to engage with in some fashion, because I want as much as possible to go in with a clean slate. However, with Cowboy Bebop, given that it is such a pivotal show for so many people and that it has had such an impact on anime overall, or at least people's impressions of anime, it really expanded and I think popularized anime in a lot of ways here. For Western audiences, it is almost unavoidable to at least not hear some things about it, but everything I'd heard about it I was very excited about, and I didn't feel like in any way it had spoiled me or ruined me for the experience. And I think it's important to note what I'd heard about it before, as I do think that it kind of set up a certain level of expectations for me, and so I want to address those things as it informs what my first impressions have turned out to be. I, in a lot of ways, thought Cowboy Bebop was going to be the absolute perfect show for me, and specifically I should say me and my husband, because both of us have been eagerly anticipating watching this show for years at this point. Both of us were music majors. My husband specifically majored in jazz performance, and that is where we met. We met in college, and so I would go to jam sessions all the time. Him and a lot of his friends for their recitals had to make arrangements for pieces and perform those, and so I was going to all my friends' recitals, and a lot of them are phenomenal, and then we would go to jazz concerts together. So I have actually experienced jazz a lot, and I was really excited to see it integrated into a show that is also an anime, because I've been a huge fan of anime since I was a kid. The idea of combining these two things in a very meaningful way was really, really exciting and sounded very appealing to me. Just the fact that the episodes were called sessions, I thought was really, really fun. I'd also heard that, of course, especially given that the name is called Cowboy Bebop, that there would be this space western setting, and that was very appealing to me in general as somebody who's a fan of science fiction and fantasy. But also, my dad was born and raised in Arizona, and he is somebody who, before he passed away, he would tell me all these stories about growing up here before this state that I live in had really become a little bit more industrialized, we'll say. It really had this almost Wild West feeling, and I grew up watching so many westerns with him as well, so I truly feel like I was going into the show being the perfect viewer for it, that there was going to be so many pieces that I was going to really, really love. But in a way, I almost think that given I have so much experience with the pieces that have made up Cowboy Bebop, that I sort of accidentally have had very high expectations that I haven't quite discerned just yet if it's me being a little bit unfair to the show and expecting it to be something based off of the expectations I had beforehand, or if perhaps it just at the end of the day is not something that is as much going to be my cup of tea. And I think an apt analogy for how I'm personally feeling about the show thus far is, by no means am I disliking it. I am neither liking it or hating it, though. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. And so I feel I want to compare this to my experiences performing in pit orchestras, and specifically I want to tie this to my experiences performing for the West Side Story show. And I think most people are very aware of West Side Story, but if you are only tangentially aware of it, then you probably are thinking of it in relation to songs like Maria or America. I think a lot of people don't really know the ins and outs of musical theater, but I actually think Cowboy Bebop in a lot of ways reminds me of musical theater, because a lot of anime has incredible music, and I think it would be borderline foolish to say that animators and the musicians, and specifically the composers, aren't at least in each other's orbits when they are discussing how to bring these two things together. They very much are working together to create a final product that is going to be very seamless. I do think that Cowboy Bebop is trying to more so have the music feel almost like a character in and of itself within the show. And the reason I feel that it's important to tie this together with something like musical theater is, if you don't know, a lot of times when you go to a performance, there is a live orchestra under the stage, which I feel a little bit like I'm being condescending in saying that, but there have been a lot of people where when I've invited them to performances where I was in the pit orchestra, they come out of it saying like, where were you? And you're like, oh, I was under the stage the whole time. The orchestra was down there. And they sometimes are really shocked because they're like, I thought that was just a recording that was playing. And people don't really recognize just how much you have to really time everything together. And the music in West Side Story, there's some parallels to the time period of influences and when it was written and the kind of music that you see in Cowboy Bebop. So there's some parallels. I think Cowboy Bebop definitely leans more big band and feels a lot jazzier. But regardless, there are some things that are somewhat similar in that department. If you're interested, I would advise checking out The Rumble from West Side Story. I'd actually just listen to it from the soundtrack first, then actually try to find some kind of recording of the performance where you actually get to see the actors, because I think it's very interesting to listen to the music alone because it sounds relatively chaotic, and then listen to it watching the way that it has to match what the performers are doing. But in a live performance in musical theater, you have to rehearse over and over and over again to make sure everything is incredibly in sync, and then you have to deliver on that live. So the idea of everything coming together this way is something that I think is really, really cool, and I love the idea of combining anime and music in this fashion, and specifically jazz, because it's not really a musical genre I think most people associate with anime, so I really like that component. Obviously, my connections to the musical side of things are more obviously tied to the way that the musicians are performing for Cowboy Bebop's soundtrack, but then I would say that the animation is more so mirroring the work that the people on stage are doing, and maybe even the people that are doing stage direction and are doing the settings and everything like that. All of the props, it's like all of those pieces have to work really well as well. But where I think in both scenarios, I think this proves true for both West Side Story and for Cowboy Bebop, is as much as I appreciate all the work that goes into it, as much as I love playing in the pit orchestra for it, as much as I love literally the music, because the music is fantastic in both of these things, I don't like the story of West Side Story, and so I don't really want to watch it. I just want to listen to the soundtrack, and currently, and that's why I said I feel like this analogy really encompasses a lot of my feelings so far. Currently, I think that the animation in Cowboy Bebop is great. I think that the music is fantastic. I think there are potential themes alluded to. I can't know for certain because, of course, I'm only a few episodes in, but there are potential themes alluded to currently that I could see finding meaningful. But I've come away from the first 3 episodes kind of being like, I just want to listen to the soundtrack. So I have kind of the same feeling for both these things, despite having an immense appreciation for so many of the ingredients that make these things what they are. I think there's still one component of them, which in both these scenarios is kind of rooted in the actual watching of the story unfold. And that part's not really pulling me in just yet. Now, of course, with these being first impressions, I fully anticipate that the more I watch, the more I'm going to be invested in these characters. Thus far, I don't really find the characters to be characters I like very much. I think a lot of people, if I were to take a guess, think that Spike is really cool. I don't like him though because of the types of things I think his character, kind of character that I am getting from what I've seen so far that he is portraying, doesn't tend to work in most things. It's not a fault of this show. It's just a personal preference side of this. So I have some of my notes, so I'm going to reference them as I'm looking at it. So very early on in episode 1 in Asteroid Blues, you see him having a conversation with Jet, and it's while he's eating this food that isn't very good because they're kind of missing the best ingredient within it. And I will say, I think there's a lot thematically within this story that is very indicative of the life of a person between the ages of 19 and 25 when they're either in college or just out of college. They have no idea what they're going to be doing with their life, and maybe they find that they're living just to try to feel something, and they sort of have this general apathy, and they're sort of bored with life because as a child you have wonder and you have this idea of everything is open to me, and then you get a little older and you're like, actually life is kind of not great sometimes, and there's a lot of restrictions on us based off of money, which that's a thing I want to note later. just also based off an interaction within episode 1, but just that feeling of basically like being a college kid with a ton of debt. You don't really like your job, and it's just day in and day out of the same old, and you just want to live for something that makes you feel alive. I definitely think he represents that, but just the fact that he's eating food that kind of sucks also, I think, speaks to that feeling in a very tangible way almost, and that like you can literally imagine yourself being that person eating ramen in college. That's kind of what it feels like. But during this conversation, this is the point I was trying to make, he's talking to Jet, and Jet is informing him that, yeah, we had money, but then you crashed all these things, and he's listing off all these reasons why they're completely out of money again. And he's kind of like, oh, fine, you know, and I do personally already feel like there is almost a parental role that Jet is fulfilling that makes me, and this is, I guess, sort of a prediction of mine, I am curious to see if we get more to do with this character, if it's going to turn out that he had some kind of family, whether that was, you know, a wife and kids, or he had an elderly family member, or he had a best friend, somebody that he found himself very much taking on a role of being, in some fashion, maybe not even just a caregiver, but a provider of some kind, and then something happened with them, and now he's sort of pushing all of those feelings onto Spike. So that's, I suppose, something that I'm wondering, or maybe it's not going to be anything quite like that or anything so overt, but that's a little prediction thus far. Regardless, you're seeing this play out between them, and I wrote in my notes, Spike is reckless, got it. And the reason I wanted to note this in particular, and how it ties to his character, is currently my impression of him is he is somebody who, especially after telling somebody else that he's essentially already died once, that he has had life kind of flash before his eyes, and it's messed with him in some fashion, and so now he, despite the fact that he comes across cool, calm, and collected, emphasis on cool, that he is looking to constantly put himself in, and I worded this before as he's just trying to feel alive, he keeps kind of being reckless, and he keeps going out of his way to try and feel something, because I think potentially he is very depressed, and maybe, truthfully, is feeling a numbness to all of life, and so by engaging in reckless behavior, it makes him at least feel something. That is the impression of this character that I have currently. Again, this is something that can be very relatable to a lot of people, and while I gave a specific time frame of an age that I think a lot of people really end up feeling this, you can feel this at various different stages of your life. So I'm not trying to dismiss the significance of, if I'm correct in identifying some of these themes, this kind of like apathy almost, this understated apathy hidden behind a cool demeanor. If I'm correct about that, I don't by any means want to dismiss that this can be valuable for a lot of people. I think the reason that this type of character doesn't tend to appeal to me is that oftentimes that recklessness is going to affect other people at some point, and this was how I felt about the character Tao from the book Rage of Dragons, or Kvothe from Kingkiller. There are times where these characters engage in certain activities, not really necessarily always considering the consequences, not necessarily considering how these things can bleed into other areas and affect other people in negative ways, and they don't really consider it, but then once they're confronted with it, then there's this level of they are horrified, and then now it's sort of feeding back into what they were already feeling, which is this numbness. It kind of now is starting to make them feel guilty, and then they take away the wrong lesson because it's just kind of further reaffirming the thing that made them want to seek out recklessness in the first place. And what I want from these characters is to shake them and be like, consider other things, please. Try to think through your actions first. And they don't tend to do that. And while I think it's realistic, it can be kind of frustrating to watch unfold. This, to me, plays very much into what I'm personally considering a criticism, but I'm going to wait until the end of the show before I properly label it as such, which is to say the almost borderline inexcusable amounts of luck and Deus Ex Machina that you are getting in these first 3 episodes alone. It's astounding, but I think maybe it's playing into this, because within the first episode, when they're seeking out the individual who is taking all of these drugs, our character goes to, I guess, a magical Native American. I didn't really love that part, I'm not gonna lie. But it's a little bit older and it's dated, and I'm like, okay, it's an older thing. But he goes to this individual, and then they tell him where he can find this person, so to speak. It's very cryptic, but he's given the answers that he needs right away. And then the person, once he finds them, when he's having this conversation with the woman, he could easily have been killed, but he's not killed just yet. The woman kind of intervenes, and the guy stops even though he wanted to kill him. So it's a little convenient. And then he goes exactly to where he was going to go, and he happens to have pocketed something while he was being choked. And there's a lot of things that are somewhat plot convenient in that first episode. In the second episode, there is a lot of exactly the right place, right time when it comes to the dog and the briefcase and all of these things. There's a lot of convenience that has to happen. Thus far, none of the convenient things have, for me, leaned into intentionality to be funny territory, with one exception, which is when the dog falls off the bridge, and then the dog lands perfectly, and plus, it's not only not hurt, but it happens to land exactly with him again. And so that part, to me, like, that was kind of funny, and I think there is oftentimes intentionality where you purposefully have plot convenience to be hilarious. I think Spy Family does this all the time, and it is indeed funny. But I didn't really feel like the whole right place, right time thing was particularly humorous. Episode 3 was the most egregious with this, where you see not only does he happen to look like the person that Faye is meant to look for, then he decides to keep the chip, then he bumps into the guy, both of their chips go flying, he happens to accidentally step on the chip and he gets it. So there is this persistent Deus Ex Machina that I do not like currently, and the reason I say that I can't label it as criticism just yet is because if it is very intentionally actually tied to the luck component of his recklessness, then I could see this being done in a way that is interesting. So I think episode 1, which was, I think, probably the best one of these first 3. In episode 1, you see that at the end of the episode, the character that he was following, as well as the woman that was with him, they end up dying. And he has this expression on his face, and it's really honestly the only time he makes an expression even like this, where suddenly the cool, calm demeanor is gone, and there is this moment of horror, and then he's kind of right back to business as usual. And it feels like he's almost not really processed this, and you could almost decide he's not processing it because the show's not that serious. We're just beep-bobbing around. It's fun. It's cool. But I don't really know if that's what it is. I think that this is potentially both foreshadowing for things to come, as well as a hint into some of his past, which is that, and the way it ties into the luck component, is you can be reckless time and time again. And there is a lesson of like, well, everything works out in the end. But you only need one time for things to go wrong, for someone to die, or for you to be completely changing your life forever. And I kind of feel like that moment was a hint, because they're having this casual conversation early on, and he's interacting with them, and he's kind of going about the whole situation of trying to find the both of them in a way that doesn't seem all that serious. And then something serious happens, and when it does, there is this sort of look of, I can't believe that just happened, but then we don't process it. So I imagine that way in the future, something is going to go wrong. I wouldn't even be surprised if once again we see a lack of processing also from Spike's perspective. And then I think we're just going to see slow character changes. There's a shift in him, but it's not going to be stated outright. These are my predictions based off of these first impressions. If none of that proves true, and it just turns out that he really is apparently unbelievably lucky, then I don't like that. And I also would go as far as to say it brings it down, and for me makes the writing definitely not on par with some of the writing from some other things that I greatly enjoy. But I can't really say definitively just yet. If it turns out that it's at least some version of what I'm talking about, or it's something different, but it does seem like there's intentionality there, then I'm willing to say, okay, it looks like there was a point to it. I don't know if it'll turn out that I like what it's doing, but I can at least appreciate the potential of what it might be trying to say. I'll also note that the very, very, very brief opening that you get before episode 1 officially starts, I imagine this is in the future. It's possible that this is one of the past events that was alluded to, but my guess is this is going to be where everything goes. And it did have a very different tone to it than what I've seen from the first few episodes and what I imagine you're going to get for a lot of the show, which is why I wonder if this is kind of slow unraveling, where the fact that Spike is currently, by my estimate, actually potentially depressed, or at the very least bored with life, and thus he's just kind of putting on this front for himself as much as for everybody else. I could see it where it just kind of continuously morphs into something darker, and then it goes from being just kind of bored and numb to just genuinely maybe hateful and angry, and that even the absence of color for the most part within that opening I could see being a reflection of the things that at least made him seem like there was more life in him before you took all that away from him and this is what's left. I could kind of see that being a thing. I don't know though. This is definitely me making some pretty big leaps here, but those are my first impressions. As I said, I'm not necessarily loving it or hating it by any means. I really do feel like I just need to give it more of a watch. There are other things that I have started where I am kind of in the middle and I turn out to love them. For an example, I was very like, I don't know, Eren yells a lot at the beginning of Attack on Titan, and then I turned out to think that was one of the best ever. I mean, I love Attack on Titan. And then there are times where I immediately love something like Spy Family, and then I keep loving it. Those are drastically different stories. I don't know if you can get too different between Spy Family and Attack on Titan, but my point is just, I could very easily see myself falling in love with this as we progress, and also I could see myself being like, I don't know, maybe. It just depends on what we end up getting with the rest of it. The last thing I'll say is I'm just kind of reinforcing that the music in this is so good. The music in this is great, and that opening for the credits is fantastic. I mean, this is definitely going to probably rank. I know for a lot of people, they're very into ranking the opening credits music. This one, I'm like, oh, it's so filthy though. It's so good. I like it so much, and I just want to listen to that. So really, really love the music. I think the best way to summarize is to say that at the very least, I am going to keep watching because the music is that good. So, oh, and the dog. The dog is so cute. I have a very, very, very bad little doodle that I drew in my notes of the dog. It's not good at all. It's way too chonky. But, you know, put a dog in there and you're instantly bumping it up for me. The dog is my favorite. The dog and Jet are my favorite characters so far. We've only been introduced to 4 characters if you're including the dog, so it's probably not saying much, but those are my favorites so far. That's it though for my first impressions of Cowboy Bebop. I will see where things go from here. Thanks so much for watching. Don't spoil anything, you know, don't tell me if I'm onto something or if I'm not onto something. I don't want to know. I just want to watch and find out. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.